All right, what's up, everybody? So today I'm going to be talking about why you have lagging delts and why you might be struggling to grow your delts. The first reason for this is probably genetics. And as crazy as that might sound and as much of a negative feeling as that might give you, this is actually a reason to have some optimism. And it's because I don't believe that your genetics will hold you back from being able to grow big delts. What it means is that you simply just have to understand training more, and you have to be more precise and more consistent with your training. A lot of the people that try and say, just eat and lift, and that's all you have to do. Just drink a gallon of milk, go lift heavy, push yourself, and just everything will magically happen. Those are the people that have the good genetics, that are more gifted for lifting, that can get away with not being precise with their training. For somebody like me or you, where we're just kind of an average Joe, what you have to do is understand your training and be incredibly precise with it. That's why people like me and people on this platform think about this stuff a lot and go a little bit deeper into some of these topics where a lot of people might say that we're overthinking. It's because we have to do this kind of stuff to actually get the best results we can and to actually get as far as we want to get in lifting. So precision and learning and doing all that stuff to help overcome your genetics is 100% possible in most cases. So I would encourage you to say, if you think you have bad genetics, that's not an excuse to not get big delts. That's a reason to be more precise with your training to make up for that lost ground. So the first point that I have here, the reason why most people have small delts, in my opinion, is going to be poor programming. And this is one of three main reasons that I have today. But basically what I want to say with the poor programming is delts are always entirely trained after chest in people that have insufficient delts or people that have lagging delts. And what I mean by this is, if you're doing a push day or an upper day, you do all of your chest lifts and then all of your shoulder lifts after that. So not only are you more systemically fatigued from having a handful of lifts prior, regardless of whether it's chest or whatever, but your chest training will fatigue the muscles that are involved with your shoulder training to a degree. It will fatigue your front delts a little bit, fatigue the side delts a little bit. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is, in my opinion, a case of building up a little bit of fatigue in the delts, but probably not enough to create stimulus to actually grow. So is this an issue? Maybe, maybe not. What I think some people need to start doing is staggering their chest and their delt training a little bit more and making it a sequence where maybe you alternate between chest and shoulder lifts, say on a push day or even an upper day to start. Especially if delts are a high priority for you, you should at least have one or two lifts for them earlier in the session. And I'm not saying to do your overhead press variations and your vertical pressing before you train chest, unless chest truly is a lower priority for you. Because you can effectively train chest and then shoulders after in most cases, but it's hard to train your shoulders effectively and then still train chest to its fullest capacity after that. But an example of what I might do here is say you have your main chest movement for that day, that opener, let's say it's a Smith machine bench. What you could do next, instead of going into maybe your second chest press for that day, you could do maybe a shoulder press or some shoulder isolation. So you could do maybe your Smith bench to start, and then go right into like a cable lateral raise or a dumbbell lateral raise and start working on your shoulders a little bit. From there, you can go back into chest, whether it's a fly, another machine, or a dumbbell press or something like that. That way you actually have some high quality shoulder work earlier in the session. And these are just little programming tips that can help you work your delts out a little bit earlier in the session. And don't be afraid to do this too before maybe going back into some chest work. Getting in some side delt work isn't really going to affect your chest work too much after that. I'd argue that doing some overhead presses and a lot of front delt work probably will have a negative impact if you're doing chest lifts after that in the session. But doing a little bit of side delt work, especially rear delt work, that won't affect it at all. Side delts, you'd be surprised that you could probably go right back into chest training and not really have much of a negative impact from that side delt training. Basically, just being more mindful of your exercise sequencing within each session will help out quite a bit. Being able to find little ways to sneak shoulder work earlier in your session is a pretty good way to actually get higher quality delt work, where physically you're more prepared to do it, and mentally we all know we're more focused earlier on in the session. And the next major point that I have for why people struggle to grow their delts and why you might have lagging delts is insufficient isolation. There's a few different points I want to cover here, but the first one would be, generally speaking, isolation lifts get referred to as accessory lifts. You guys have been following me long enough to know that I don't really like the term accessory lift because it implies that it's lesser, and its only importance is to serve something that's bigger than itself. So a lateral raise or a front raise isn't to support your bench press, it's to support your chest training. It's to grow your delts, and that's entirely what it's for. So I think when people hear the word accessory or isolation, they just automatically put that lift a little bit lower down. They push it kind of farther back in the day. They don't really train it with that much mental focus or that much physical intensity. And what this leads to is a complete waste of time. And this is why people think isolation work doesn't really work that well. They're like, oh, you just have to do compounds and just stick to the basics to get big. Those people half-ass their isolation work. That's entirely what it is. If you're not growing from isolation work, you're literally just doing it wrong. So a lot of the time with this, the effort levels are entirely insufficient. And with higher effort levels on your isolation work for your shoulders, your technique will automatically improve because you're paying more attention to it. So you'll actually be thinking about it and focusing on it a little bit more. When you're putting high effort into something, you'll do everything you can to make sure it goes well. With high effort, guess what else happens? A closer proximity to failure. So when you're paying more attention to that, guess what happens? More mechanical tension. And guess what happens there? You guessed it, more growth. So when you're just spamming a 3x10 of a dumbbell lateral raise, you're not filming your sets, you're barely paying attention to them, and you're doing it at the end of the workout, and then you complain why your shoulders don't grow. I think it's pretty obvious why, right? So to expand a little bit further on the insufficient isolation, this can also just be an entire lack of isolation and expecting your shoulders to grow from indirect work from training your chest and your back. And listen, like, you can train your delts from just training your chest and your back when you're doing row variations or lat variations or even horizontal presses for your chest. You're still going to be working your front delts and your rear delts a decent amount. But this is the difference between good genetics and bad genetics. Someone with good genetics can probably get away with just doing that and maybe a little bit of isolation here and there. But someone that has just average genetics or even bad genetics, because of course that's a thing too, you have to be more precise and you're going to have to isolate and really train that muscle probably harder than most people will have to get it to grow and to really get it moving. And that's something that I've experienced a ton, where I've had the strong bench, I've had the strong, and basically anything for back, but my delts were lagging to a point until I started to do more isolation with super high effort. And I went pretty high in volume too. I'm not saying you have to do that. That's just what worked for me. Don't worry too much about the volume or anything yet. Focus on the effort, the intensity, and overall just the programming, and then you can kind of adjust things from there. I know I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. So another thing here is most lifters are lat dominant. So you might be thinking, what does this have to do with growing your shoulders? This means that your rear delts, if you're doing insufficient isolation or even no isolation, you might not be getting any. Obviously, you're not getting any direct work, but you might not even be getting indirect work from your back training. And what I mean by this is when you row, most lifters are going to be lat dominant, and you're naturally going to row with tucked elbows. To train the rear delts optimally, you have to have your elbows flared out quite a bit. And 90% of programs don't have elbow flared rows. And even if they do, even if the lifter does imply to have like an upper back focused row in their program, I guarantee that 80% of lifters out there don't even know that they're doing a lat biased row and keeping their elbows tucked in the whole time. And that's not really going to train your rear delts that much. So I would emphasize doing your rows properly, flaring your elbows out a little bit more depending on the muscles you're trying to hit, and you probably will get more rear delt growth just from that. But the main point that I'm talking about here is most people don't even get indirect rear delt work because they row and they do all their lat movements and upper back movements with super tucked in elbows like this. So they're just rowing like this. You're not really getting a whole ton of rear delt out of that. And the last point that I have here is that a lot of people think vertical pressing is all you need to grow your delts. So when it comes to vertical pressing, there's obviously a bunch of different variations of a vertical press you can do. And I'm not going to talk about any specific one today because they're all relatively similar, but clearly there's a couple issues with just relying on vertical pressing. One, the rear delts don't even get trained from a vertical press. And like I mentioned earlier, where if all of your back work is kind of intentionally or unintentionally lat focused, you're not getting a whole ton of rear delts. So there's a clear neglect of the rear delts in most people's training and most people's lifting execution. So putting more of an emphasis on them is going to be important. I'd argue that rear delts should have even more of an emphasis than front delts in most cases, because it's harder to train them indirectly than it is maybe your front delt. Another issue with just banking on vertical pressing is that you're like kind of expecting your side delts to grow from vertical pressing. And I'm not saying that they can't, but it's not guaranteed. Some lifters, and it's a little bit different from everybody, there's some guys that can just do a bunch of vertical pressing and their shoulders blow up. And that's cool. Like, I respect that. And if you can get away with that, that's awesome. But at the same time, for someone like myself, I didn't grow my shoulders from vertical pressing. I grew them pretty much purely from isolation work. I never really did that much overhead pressing. I did a little bit, but I didn't take it that seriously. My strength numbers in that weren't even close to what they were for my bench or at any other like big lifts or anything. So basically what I'm trying to say is you can grow good front delts and side delts from vertical pressing, but it's not guaranteed that the side delts will grow, since it's not a direct function of the side delts. So what I'd recommend is adding in more side delt training. Kind of as simple as that. And the takeaway message that I want to leave you guys with this video is, in bodybuilding, a lot of the time you can get muscles to grow from indirect work, but it doesn't happen all the time. It totally depends on your technique and a lot of other programming and genetic variables. So what I would say is, if you have a muscle that's a lower priority, you can use the mindset of, I hope this grows from just training something else. So for myself, an example of that would be, I don't really care that much about my glutes. They're already pretty jacked. So I'll take any extra growth that I get from my quad training for my glutes. So if I'm doing a squat variation with a quad bias, if I get glute growth from that, great. If not, then maybe I'll have to add in some isolation. If a muscle is a high priority, so for myself, I definitely think shoulders are a pretty high priority. I've had periods where they're super high on the priority list, and I've had periods where I just stopped training them entirely. But with a muscle like shoulders, you can get a lot of indirect work. But since it's a high priority, I wouldn't bank on that. So what I would do is simply just tune in my programming a little bit more, and I would add a little bit of isolation work. And here's the thing. Isolation work, it's not going to bite you, it's not going to kill you, it's not going to hurt you, it's not going to impact your recovery. Most people don't need to worry about recovery, especially from isolation work for the shoulders. But what I'm trying to say, you don't need a whole ton. A little will go a long way. Doing 2 sets of a lateral raise variation twice a week, and then maybe the same thing for rear delts with a little bit of vertical pressing, is a great start point for most people. And that's essentially what I'm even doing now. So the takeaway message, you don't need a whole ton. If your delts are a high priority for you, just get the insurance of some of that isolation work. It's not going to kill you. So without going any further into that, that's pretty much all I got for you guys today. If you have any questions or anything, let me know. I'll see you guys in the next video.